The Velthari did not arrive with fire. They arrived with math. A signal broadcast simultaneously across every major communications network on Earth: radio, satellite, fiber, submarine cable, every frequency of human transmission, every protocol, every encryption layer peeled back like wet paper. The message was clean. The message was precise. The message was in 43 languages, and in each one it said the same thing with the same clinical calm of a man reading a utility bill. You have been assessed. You are viable. Surrender 40% of your planetary biomass for processing within 60 of your rotations, or we will take what we require by force. This is not a negotiation. This is a census. They had been watching for 11 years. They said so in the message. They cited population figures. They cited soil pH and average caloric density and the protein yield per human unit. They had names for the continents. Not Earth names, their names. Taxonomic designations from a catalog that had apparently existed for longer than human writing. The governments of Earth spent 4 days arguing about whether the message was real. On the 5th day, the Velthari sent a demonstration. They dropped a gravity anchor over the city of Marseille, France, population 870,000. The anchor was the size of a bus. It fell slowly, lazily, at a pace that every person in the city could watch from their windows and rooftops and the decks of boats in the old harbor. It did not explode. It did not burn. It simply pressed down, and everything within a radius of 4 kilometers was compressed flat over the course of 6 hours, the way you might press a flower between the pages of a book. No warning, no declaration of war, a demonstration. The world learned the word Velthari in the way you learn the word metastatic. Her name was Rena Endo. She had 2 names because she was 2 things that didn't fit together. The second name, Sayama, was her stage name. Rena Sayama, pop idol, recording artist, the girl with the big voice and the bigger smile, whose 3rd single had gone certified platinum across 12 countries, whose face was on bus shelters in 6 capital cities, who had 40 million followers on 3 platforms, and who, according to a poll in a pop culture magazine, was voted most likely to make you feel okay about things. She read that and sat with it for a while. Most likely to make you feel okay about things. She wasn't sure if that was the nicest compliment she'd ever received or the saddest. The first name was just Rena. The girl her father, Detective Yasuk Endo, Metropolitan Police, divorced, 1 daughter, bad coffee habit, had raised in a 3-room apartment in Shinjuku, above a ramen shop, in the years after her mother died. Her mother whom she didn't remember. Her mother whose name her father never said, not in any tone that invited follow-up questions. She was 17 when the Velthari arrived. 18 when the first round of what they were calling asterisk resistance operations began, and the men in the armored suits went to war. She was not one of the men in the armored suits. She had asked. She had gone to the building on Sumiyoshi Street that everyone in the industry knew about but no one officially acknowledged. The SSSB, the Science Special Search Party, the organization that had been fighting alien incursions for 2 decades in quiet, which was now fighting them loudly, whether it wanted to or not. She had walked in through the main entrance and asked to help. The man at the intake desk was young and uncomfortable, with the posture of someone used to delivering bad news. He had looked at her and then at his screen and then at her again. "Miss Sayama," he said carefully, "we appreciate your—" "I'm not here as a celebrity," she said. "I'm here as a person. What do you need?" He told her they needed morale support. He told her they'd be in touch about public service announcements. He gave her a pamphlet. She took it. She read it on the train home. It was about emergency preparedness and had a cartoon of a family crouching under a table. She folded it into a paper crane and left it on the seat when she got off. The war, if you called it that, lasted 8 months before it stopped being called a war, and started being called something else. There were 7 men in Ultraman suits. That was the number that mattered. 7 humans who carried a genetic trace, faint, diluted, almost gone, of something that had come down from the stars 60 years ago, when a being of pure light had merged with a pilot named Shin Hayata over a mountain lake and fought monsters for years before returning home. The light had left a mark on Hayata's DNA. His son Shinjiro had inherited it more strongly. Others, traced through medical files and blood samples, carried thin versions of it, Moriboshi and 5 others. 7 suits, 7 carriers, 7 people who could take a hit that would kill an ordinary human and stand back up. Against the Velthari ground forces, the Kalim, what humans were calling the soldiers, gray-skinned and 6-limbed and armored in a material that laughed at conventional weapons, 7 was not enough. Everyone knew it. The SSSP knew it. The General Council of the Galactic Cluster Star Council, the alien diplomatic body that had been operating on Earth in secret for 2 decades, knew it. The Velthari simply had not counted on any meaningful resistance at all, which bought time, but bought it in the currency of bodies. Rena watched it on the news. She watched Shinjiro. She knew it was him. She recognized the way he moved even inside the suit, take 3 Kalim down in a street in Seoul, and then take a plasma burst to the chest that threw him 40 meters into a building. She watched him get up. She watched him get up every time because the light in his cells said no asterisk to dying, but the light in his cells also had limits, and she watched those limits get closer each time she watched him fight. She went back to the building on Sumiyoshi Street. "I need to speak to someone in command," she said. "Not intake, command." They made her wait for an hour and a half. Then a man named Edo, silver-haired and tired in the way of someone who had been tired for 20 years and had simply adjusted to it, walked out and looked at her. "Miss Endo," he said, her real name, not the stage name. "You know who I am," she said. "I know what you are," he said, which was different. "Your father knows what you are. He's known since you were 3 years old." He paused. "The question is whether you know." She looked at the pamphlet she'd folded into a crane and somehow kept carrying for 8 months, tucked in the inside pocket of her jacket. She looked at Edo. "Tell me," she said. Her mother was not from here. Her mother had come to Earth with a family of refugees, one of several species that had sought asylum on the planet quietly, filtering into human lives, taking human names, living carefully on the margins of cities, avoiding the kind of attention that would force the question of what they were. They were not Velthari. They were something older, something that had known the Velthari for centuries, something that had been losing to them for that entire time. Her mother's people were called, in their own language, the Orin, beings of stored light. They could generate it from within themselves, a biological mechanism that science hadn't had words for because science hadn't known to look. Her mother had met Detective Endo when he was a young officer, before he had the weight of it. Her mother had been kind and careful and small, the way people are when they've learned to make themselves small as a survival strategy. They had loved each other in a quiet, practical way, the way people love when they're both a little afraid of the world but less afraid of each other. When Rena was born, she had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness. When the Velthari arrived, the Orin diaspora on Earth went to ground. Some of them tried to leave. Most of them couldn't. And a few of them, the ones who had bled enough human DNA into their children, who had diluted the signal enough to pass, stayed exactly where they were and tried not to glow. Rena had never glowed, not once. Not until the back of her hand lit up like the inside of a lamp, warm and white and steady, in the middle of a conversation at a coffee shop, while a boy she half knew was making an excuse to leave. She had pressed her hand flat against the table and looked at the light bleeding between her fingers. Oh, asterisk, she had thought, that explained some things. Edo explained what she could do in the same tone that other people used to explain tax law, clinical, organized, a little distant, because distance was how people delivered information that changed everything. The light was not a weapon, not inherently. The Orin used it for communication, for healing, for a kind of resonance that their nervous systems required the way humans required sleep. It was built into their cellular structure, and it ran on something that wasn't quite ATP and wasn't quite photosynthesis, but was somewhere between the two. It sustained itself. It regenerated. It could not, under normal circumstances, be removed or depleted. Under abnormal circumstances, it could be pushed. Overdriven, the light became something else, something that the Velthari's armor was not designed to resist, something that the Velthari's gravity anchors and plasma cannons and everything else in their catalog of violence could not, because the Velthari had never encountered an Orin who had pushed. The Orin had always run. The Orin had been running for centuries. Because they're sensible, Edo said. What happens when it's pushed? Rena asked. He was quiet for a moment. You burn through. The cells that carry the light, they don't recover from overdrive. It's not like your heart rate coming back down, it's more like. He seemed to search for the right comparison. Fuses, he said. When fuses blow, they're gone. How long can it be pushed before the fuses blow? We don't know. We've never had a subject. How long is the estimate? 3 minutes, he said. Perhaps a little more, perhaps a little less. After that, whatever you do, you will not be able to do again. She sat with that. 3 minutes. A single song was 3.5 minutes, roughly. She had performed in stadiums. She had held a note for 37 seconds in the bridge of her second single and felt her vision go white at the edges and come back. Teach me to use it, she said. It's not that simple. The suit we've designed for you requires. I know it requires things. Everything worth doing requires things. Teach me. He looked at her the way people looked at her when they were deciding whether to tell her she couldn't do something. She was used to that look. She'd been getting it since she was 12, when her singing teacher told her that her voice was pretty but not strong enough for the big stages. She had gotten onto the big stages by being the person who always came back the next day. You understand, Edo said, that if this works it will not work twice. I understand, she said. That's why it has to work the first time. The suit they gave her was different from the others. Theirs were red and gray, built on a frame of compressed metal alloy with power cells derived from the original Ultraman's biology, running on the inherited light in their DNA like generators. They could fight for hours. They could take punishment and redistribute it. They were tools for sustained combat. Hers was white, not armored white, luminous white, like a lamp seen through paper, like the winter sky just before the sun comes over the horizon. It was thinner than the others. It wasn't designed for sustained combat. It was designed for one thing, to channel, to focus, to direct. To take the light in her cells and push it outward in a single concentrated sustained event, the way a lens focuses sunlight to a point that burns. The designer, a small, irritable engineer named Ide who had not slept properly in several months, handed it to her with the expression of someone handing over a piece of work they were terrified would be misused. The collar activates the amplification, he said. Don't activate it until you've positioned yourself. The field of effect at full output is approximately 200 meters. Anything Velthari in that radius. What about people? The Orin light doesn't affect human biology. It's specific to structures with certain mineral compounds in their cellular matrix, which the Velthari have and humans don't. And other aliens, the ones living here. Ide paused. It'll feel like standing in very bright sunshine for about 5 seconds and then it'll pass. They'll be fine, we think. She put the suit on. It fit like it had been waiting for her. She had 8 weeks before she had to use it. 8 weeks of training in a basement that smelled of recycled air and old coffee, with Shinjiro as her sparring partner, her partner in the suit she'd recognized, who turned out to be a quiet, serious boy with the kind of face that looked like it was always slightly surprised by itself. He didn't treat her like a celebrity. He didn't treat her like a weapon. He treated her like someone learning something hard, which was the most useful thing anyone had done for her in a long time. Moriboshi treated her like a liability. He said so, not unkindly, but with the precision of someone who had stopped softening things because the world had stopped deserving softness. He watched her spar and crossed his arms and said, "You're not trained. You're not a fighter. You're a biological event. We should not be treating this as a military asset." "You don't have enough military assets," she said. "No," he said, "we don't, which means we shouldn't be gambling the one irreplaceable thing we have on a battlefield." "Where do you suggest I use it then?" He didn't have an answer for that. She could see him not having it, the calculation behind his eyes arriving at the same conclusion she'd arrived at months ago, on a train home, holding a pamphlet about crouching under tables. She kept training. Her father found out 3 weeks before the operation. He came to the SSSB building with his badge out and his jaw set, and the expression he used when he'd already decided what he was going to say, but needed to say it in order for it to be real. "You're not doing this," he said. "I am," she said. "Renee." "Dad," she took his hand. His hand was big and rough and had gone gray at the knuckles, and she had been holding it since she was 3 years old, and it had always been the same size, the way father's hands never seem to get smaller even when everything else does. "I know what you're carrying. I know you've been carrying it since I was a baby. The thing you didn't say for years because you were trying to protect me." She looked at him. "I don't need protection from what I am. I need practice with it." He made a sound that wasn't quite a word. She put her arms around him. He was stiff at first. He was always stiff when she hugged him, because he was a man of his generation and his profession, and those things had taught him that softness was something that happened to other people. But then he wasn't stiff, and they stood like that for a while in a basement that smelled of recycled air, while above them the city went about its shrinking business. He came back the next day. He sat in on the training. He didn't say anything. He just watched. She thought about her mother, who she didn't remember, who had apparently been the kind of person who ran toward the things that frightened her, like loved like. The Velthari delivered their second message on the 57th day of the 60-day countdown. It was not broadcast on communications networks this time. It was projected directly into the sky above every capital city on Earth, in letters of pale fire 3 kilometers tall, in the same 43 languages. "Your counterforces have been assessed. They are insufficient. Your decision window closes in 3 rotations. We recommend compliance. We are not cruel, we are practical. We are not cruel, we are practical." Renee read that in the sky above Tokyo, standing on the roof of the SSSB building with Shinjiro beside her. She had her hands in the pockets of her jacket. The letters hung there, perfectly calm, perfectly legible. "We are not cruel," she said. "No," Shinjiro said. "They're not, that's the thing that gets me. They're not enjoying this. It's just numbers to them." She thought about that. The Velthari had never insulted humanity, had never declared them inferior, had never shown contempt or malice or the kind of seething, theatrical hatred that made sense as a motivation. They were processing a resource. They had found something worth taking, and they were going to take it with the same moral weight as a person walking to a refrigerator. "They don't know we're people," she said slowly. "They know, they just don't care." "No," she turned the thought over. "I mean, they haven't seen it. They've seen statistics. They've seen soldiers in suits. They've seen people running, people hiding, people being afraid." She looked at the letters in the sky. "They haven't seen the thing that makes us, the thing that's actually hard to explain, the part that doesn't compute." Shinjiro looked at her. "We're not just fighting for survival," she said. "When you get up after being thrown through a building, it's not survival instinct. It's something else. It's stubbornness. It's the part of us that says asterisk, no asterisk to the math even when the math is correct. She exhaled slowly. They've never seen that up close. They don't know what to do with it. He was quiet for a long time. 3 days, he said. 3 days, she agreed. They chose the Velthari command ship. Not a battlefield, not a city street. The command ship, which had been in geostationary orbit since the initial arrival, had descended to a hover position 20 kilometers above the Pacific Ocean for the final compliance window, presumably to receive either a surrender delegation or begin the forced extraction. It was, by every technical assessment, the wrong place to be. Getting to it required an extraction vehicle that Ide had built out of components that had no business being in the same machine, running on a power source that had also technically not been cleared for use, capable of carrying 6 people and a prayer. There were 7 Ultraman units. One of them stayed behind. Moriboshi stayed behind, because someone had to coordinate ground response if this failed, and because he was the best tactical mind they had, and because he had agreed to this particular assignment with the expression of a man who had found a piece of information he did not like and had decided to act on it anyway. "Don't be stupid up there," he said to Shinjiro as they boarded. "I'll try," Shinjiro said. Moriboshi looked at Renat. "You specifically," he said, "don't be anything up there until the moment," and then he paused, "be everything." She had never heard him say anything like that before. She suspected he hadn't either. The interior of the Velthari command ship was nothing like what humans had imagined alien interiors would look like. It was not sleek, it was not dark. It was not filled with glowing panels and alien glyphs in neat rows. It was large and functional and somewhat ugly, in the way that all large functional things are ugly, exposed conduits, metal grating underfoot, lighting that was slightly too orange for human comfort, the background hum of machinery that had been running for a long time without anyone thinking much about how it looked. They had 5 minutes before the incursion was detected. That was Ide's estimate. In practice, they had 3.5. The Velthari soldiers came in waves, not because of poor tactical planning, but because the ship was large and the corridors were narrow, and you could only send so many through at once. The 5 suited fighters held the corridor outside the central processing hub, the place where, according to the intelligence they'd pulled from a captured Velthari logistics node, the compliance assessment was being run. The processor. The accountant, Renath thought. She thought about the letters in the sky. "We are not cruel, we are practical." She held back, as she'd been told. She stayed at the rear of the group while the fight moved forward, and she pressed herself against the wall when the plasma bursts came overhead, and she watched. She watched Shinjiro take a hit and stabilize and fire back. She watched the corridor fill with light, their suits burning hot against the Velthari's dark armor, and for a moment she had the strange, sideways thought that this was what a concert looked like from backstage. All that noise and heat and desperate effort, and the audience never really understood how much went into it. Then the inner door opened. Not because they had breached it, because it had been opened from the inside, by the being who ran the processing assessment, who wanted to see the anomaly up close, who had reviewed the combat data and found it statistically deviant. The Velthari commander was not tall. That surprised her. She had expected tall. She had expected something that looked like authority. Instead, it was perhaps 6 feet shorter than Shinjiro in his suit, with the same gray skin and 6-limbed frame as the soldiers, but finer, more precise, the way certain professionals are precise. The hands of a surgeon, the posture of someone who has always been right and knows it. It looked at the fighters in the corridor. It looked at the small figure in the white suit at the back. It said something in Velthari that the translation relay in her collar converted to. "You sent children." "We sent everyone," Shinjiro said. "You sent insufficient numbers for any tactical objective this operation could plausibly achieve. The commander's tone was not contemptuous. It was genuinely puzzled. By my assessment, you understood this. You came regardless. Yes, Shinjiro said. That is not rational. No, he agreed, it isn't. The commander processed this. Then you are here to negotiate. You have brought a demonstration of will as a prelude to terms. We're not here to negotiate, Rena said. The commander looked at her. She felt its gaze, not hostile, not warm, simply assessing in the way a scale assessed weight. She stepped forward past Shinjiro, past the others. She heard Shinjiro shift behind her, preparing to intervene, and she held up her hand without turning around. Wait. You've been watching us for 11 years, she said. You've assessed us. You have all your data, soil pH and protein yield and population density. She stopped 10 feet from the commander. But you've never actually looked at us. I have observed extensively. You've observed input. You haven't looked at us. She could feel the light in her cells. It was always there, the warm hum of it, the thing she'd been ignoring for 18 years without knowing she was ignoring it. And now she knew what it was, and she knew what it could do, and she knew what it cost, and she looked the Velthari commander in the eye. I'm going to show you something, she said, and I need you to actually pay attention. The commander said, You are threatening force. No, she said, force is what you understand. I'm showing you something you don't. She activated the collar. It did not start as a weapon. It started as light. The kind of light that comes from inside a thing rather than bouncing off it. The difference between a mirror and a lamp. The difference between borrowed brightness and the real thing. It came from her in a wave that was warm and complete and terribly gentle, and it had no sound, but it had a kind of presence. The way a large musical chord has a presence, the way you feel it in your chest. The Velthari soldiers in the corridor stopped. Not because of the pain would come at full amplification, and she wasn't there yet. They stopped because something in the base of their nervous system, something very old that the Velthari had never fully eradicated despite centuries of trying, recognized the light, recognized what it meant. The Oran light was not alien to them. They had encountered it before, in a time before the accounting, in a time before the spreadsheets and the assessments, when the galaxy had different borders. The Velthari commander stood very still. She pushed it further. The light was not warm anymore. It was not comfortable. It was the full, concentrated output of an Oran biology that had been stored for 18 years without release, and she was releasing it now with everything she had. And in the corridor, the Velthari armor began to fail, not catastrophically, not in explosions, but in the way that systems fail when they lose power. Panels going dark, weapons going inert. The complex mineral matrix biology of the Kalim, responding to the light the way iron responds to a magnet, the way certain chemical reactions become inevitable when the catalyst is introduced. The soldiers fell. The commander did not fall. It stood and absorbed it, and she could see in its posture the effort that cost, the recalibration of something it had believed was safe, the thing it had not prepared for because nothing in its data had predicted this. She pushed it to the limit. 3 minutes, I'd had said 3 minutes. In the second minute, she stopped thinking about numbers. She thought about her father's hands. She thought about the paper crane she'd made from a pamphlet about crouching under tables. She thought about Shinjiro standing up after being thrown through a building, every time, not because the math said he should, but because something in him had decided that falling down was not the end of the conversation. She thought about the 40 million people who had voted her most likely to make them feel okay about things, and what a staggering, ordinary, beautiful act of faith that was. She thought about her mother, who she didn't remember, who had come from somewhere else and found a person and a city and a life worth having, and had decided to stay. She thought, we are not practical, we are not optimal. We are the species that runs toward the fire to pull someone out, and has no word for the calculation that makes sense, because we never needed one. The light grew until it was everything. In the third minute, the Velthari commander knelt. Not in submission. She understood that. She understood the difference. It knelt in the way that you kneel when you have encountered something your models have not prepared you for, and you need a moment to rebuild the model. Then the third minute ended. She came back to herself lying on the metal grating, with Shinjiro's hands on her shoulders and someone's voice saying her name, her real name, not the stage name. And the light in her cells was quiet in a way it had never been before, and she knew, without needing to check, that it would stay quiet. The fuses, the irreversible thing. She was still her, she was just her without the glow. She found she was okay with that. The Velthari commander was still kneeling. It was looking at her with an expression that she realized, after a moment, was the alien equivalent of a person who has just understood something they had previously treated as background noise. "You did not fight to win," it said. "We fought to be seen," she said. Her voice came out rougher than she expected, like a singer who'd pushed their voice past its limit. She knew what that felt like too. "What you generated, the output, my soldiers will recover. The ship systems will reset. You have not decisively altered the tactical situation." "I know," she said. "Then what did you?" "You said you weren't cruel," she said. "You said you were practical, but your math has an error." She sat up slowly, with Shinjiro's hand steadying her, and she looked at the commander with no light left in her cells and no weapon in her hand and nothing between her and the consequences except the same stubbornness she'd always had. "You calculated what we are worth. You didn't calculate what we cost." The commander was still. "Not in weapons, not in soldiers. In this," she gestured at herself, at the empty suit, at the corridor full of fallen Kalim who were already beginning to stir. "In what we're willing to burn. We'll burn everything. We'll always burn everything. That's not a threat, that's data. Add it to your assessment." The compliance window closed without compliance. The Velthari ship held position for 41 hours. 41 hours in which the world held its breath in the way that the world had been holding its breath for 60 days, but differently now. Not the held breath of anticipated defeat, but the held breath of something unresolved, something that had not yet tipped. On the 42nd hour, the command ship began to move. Not toward population centers, not into attack formation, upward, into ascent trajectory. Slow, deliberate, the kind of departure that wants to be noticed. It left. The analysis came later, over weeks, from sources they didn't entirely trust and data sets that were incomplete. The Velthari command structure had submitted a reassessment. The planet's resource yield had been reclassified from viable for extraction to asterisk, prohibitively costly to process. The reclassification cited an anomaly in their tactical projections, an unmeasured variable. In their own notation, the word translated approximately as unacceptable expenditure in response to unquantifiable resistance. They had done the math. The math had told them it wasn't worth it. What she had done hadn't won a battle. It had changed an accounting ledger, the most alien victory in the history of an alien war. She did not go back to pop music. She wasn't sure what she went back to. She sat in her father's apartment above the ramen shop for 3 weeks and did nothing in particular. She drank a lot of tea. She called her manager twice and told him twice that she'd be in touch. He was gracious about it. Most people were gracious about it, which she found both touching and slightly paralyzing. Shinjiro came by once out of the suit and in an ordinary jacket, with the permanent, slightly surprised expression of someone who'd signed up for one thing and was still figuring out the things that had gotten attached to it. He brought coffee, the good kind, from the place 3 blocks away. They sat on the balcony and didn't say much. The city was still the city. It smelled like car exhaust and river, and faintly, from the shop below, like soy and pork, and the specific kind of comfort that comes from something familiar. "Are you okay?" he asked eventually. She thought about it seriously, The way you think about something when you're not going to perform the answer. I think so, she said. I feel different. I feel like the thing I was carrying is gone, but I'm not sure if I'm lighter or just less than I was. He nodded. He seemed to understand that. It comes back, he said quietly. Not the same, but something comes back. The part that stands up, that doesn't go. She looked at him. How do you know? Because you're still you, he said. That was never the light. That was always just you. She turned that over in her mind, the way you turn a found coin over in your hands, looking at both sides. Her father's voice came up from inside the apartment, asking if they wanted tea. Her father, who had carried a secret for 15 years to keep her safe and ordinary, who had cried, she'd felt it rather than seen it, in a basement on Sumiyoshi Street, who had come back the next day anyway and sat in silence while she trained, because that was what love looked like when it was serious about itself. Yes, she called back, please. She looked out at the city. Somewhere in the distance, past the buildings and the river and the highway interchange, there was a museum with a giant statue of a silver giant from the stories of a previous generation. The first Ultraman, the thing that had started all of this, the cosmic accident that had left a trace in certain human blood like a message in a bottle from another world. Something came this way. Something stayed. Something of it remains. She didn't have the light anymore. She had the space where the light had been, and she was starting to understand that they were not the same shape, and that the space had its own kind of use. Moriboshi had said, be everything. She had been everything for 3 minutes, and the universe had taken note, and the universe had blinked. She thought, I'll find something else to be. Her father came out with the tea. The city smelled like ramen. The sky was perfectly ordinary, and empty and absolutely hers. In the weeks that followed, the world did not return to normal. Normal had been a specific, delicate condition requiring the mass agreement of several billion people to ignore certain things in favor of certain other things, and that agreement had broken down and couldn't be reassembled with the same materials. The Velthari's departure was confirmed, then reconfirmed, then monitored by 5 independent tracking systems and 17 governments and 3 private aerospace companies, all of whom arrived at the same conclusion with the same slightly stunned expression. They're actually leaving. The Star Cluster Council, operating no longer in secret, issued a formal statement. They explained their presence on Earth, their decades of quiet mediation, the network of alien refugees living in human cities, the science they had contributed anonymously, the disasters they had quietly helped prevent. The statement was met with approximately the reaction you would expect, which was complicated and prolonged and probably not finished yet. The SSSB became public. Not a press conference with flags, a press conference in a parking garage, because the building on Sumiyoshi Street didn't have a suitable auditorium, which Renaf found both charming and on-brand. Edo stood at a lectern with the particular dignity of a man who had been right about things for a long time without being able to say so, and explained what had happened in terms that were precise and stripped of drama, and the journalists asked questions for 3 hours, and then everyone went home and argued about it on the internet. Shinjiro gave one interview. He showed up in ordinary clothes, which surprised the interviewer who had apparently expected the suit. He was asked if he felt like a hero. He thought about it for a moment, the genuine kind of pause, not a performance, and said, I feel like someone who got up. I feel like everyone I know also got up. I'm not sure that's heroism, but it's the thing we did. The interviewer asked who he thought had been the most important person in the operation. He said a name. The fan messages started that afternoon. Not the standard fan messages, the ones that came in about concert announcements, about which song she should perform next, about her hair and her fashion, and the 70 kinds of feelings she inspired simply by existing in public. These were different. These came from people who had been watching a screen when the news broke, who had been sitting in evacuation shelters, in hospital waiting rooms, in basements and cars, and the back rooms of restaurants waiting to see if the thing they loved would survive the hour. She read them for 2 days, not because she needed to, but because she felt it would be wrong not to. One of them said, "I was in a shelter in Osaka with my 2 kids and my phone had no signal and we were just waiting. And then the signal came back and the news was on and they said it was over and they said your name. I've been a fan of yours since your first single. I never thought about what that meant before. Thank you for being the kind of person you are." She sat with that one for a long time. She thought about the word *fan. She had lived inside that word for 6 years, the weight of it, the warmth of it, the strange specific pressure of being the thing that people used to feel something when they needed to feel something. She had always thought of it as a transaction. She performed, they felt. She gave them something to hold on to. She had always thought of herself as a medium rather than the source, a mirror shaped to catch the light people already carried and give it back to them larger. But the woman in the shelter in Osaka had been waiting in the dark, and when the light came back on, it had a name on it. She wasn't sure what to do with that. It was bigger than a song and smaller than a war, and it sat exactly in the space between the two, which was apparently where she had always lived without knowing it. Moriboshi came to find her 3 weeks after. Not to the SSSB building, to her father's apartment above the ramen shop. He knocked on the door at a time that was not quite morning and not quite afternoon, the kind of in-between hour that people use when they want to arrive without ceremony, and her father answered and made tea without asking and left them alone in the kitchen, which meant he knew something Renad didn't. Moriboshi sat across from her at the kitchen table. He did not take off his jacket. He was one of those people who used clothing as armor in a way that had nothing to do with the actual armored suit. "The council has received 3 additional signals," he said. "Different species, different directions. They'll want to know what's here before they come closer." She wrapped her hands around her tea. "You're telling me it's not over?" "It's never over." That's not a pessimistic statement, it's a structural one. The galaxy is large. Humanity is new to it. We've been noticed. He looked at her with the directness that was either his greatest quality or his most exhausting one, depending on the day. "What you did on the command ship, the Council is calling it the Orin event. The Velthari have filed a formal notation with the interstellar record. They described it as a novel variable in resistance methodology." "How flattering," she said dryly. "There are species out there who'll interpret that notation as a threat, others who'll interpret it as an invitation." He paused. "And some who'll interpret it as a debt. Your mother's people, the Orin, there are more of them than you know. What you did on that ship was the first time Orin light has been used offensively in recorded history. It will travel, as information, further than the event itself." She looked at him. "What are you asking me?" "I'm asking you what you want," he said, "which is something I don't usually ask." She thought about the paper crane. She thought about the concert hall and the bombs, and the moment when she'd been 17 and watching a boy in an armored suit get thrown through buildings and stand back up. She thought about the space where the light had been, and the shape of that space, and the growing sense that it was not emptiness but capacity, room for something that hadn't arrived yet. "I want to do the thing where the next species that comes with a spreadsheet gets to find out that the math doesn't work," she said. Something shifted in Moriboshi's expression. It wasn't a smile, he didn't do those as a reflex, she'd learned, but it was the thing adjacent to one, a quality of recognition, a slight easing of the perpetual defensive tension in his face. "Then you'll need to train," he said. "I've trained before." "Not for this. The suit is rebuilt. I'd been working on it since." He stopped, reorganized. "What you did was a one-time event because you didn't know how to meter it. The energy you released in 3 minutes would have sustained for 30 minutes if you'd known how to pace it. The fuses didn't have to blow." She set down her tea. "You're saying I could still?" I'm saying the capacity is there. It's dormant. The cells aren't gone, they're in recovery. Edo consulted with 3 Oran biologists from the diaspora. The consensus is approximately 14 months before the light comes back. He looked at her with the expression of someone delivering technical information that they know is actually not technical at all. You're not burned out, Miss Endo. You're healing. She looked at her hands. No glow, no warmth. Just her father's kitchen and the distant hum of the ramen shop below and the smell of tea. But her hands were still her hands. She thought about her mother, who had come from far away and found something worth staying for. She thought about the specific act of staying, not fighting, not performing, not calculating cost and yield and risk, but just deciding that this place, these people, this impractical and frequently irrational species were worth the light, worth all of it. 14 months, she said. Give or take. What do I do for 14 months? Learn, he said, plan, and probably rest, which I understand is not your particular preference. She thought about the woman in the shelter in Osaka. She thought about 40 million people who voted her most likely to make them feel okay about things. She thought about what it meant to be a medium, a mirror, and what it meant to be a source. I have one condition, she said. Moriboshi waited. The alien town, she said. The community on Ikebukuro Street, the Oran and the others, they've been hiding for 20 years. If I'm part of this, whatever this is, they stop hiding. They're under the same umbrella as the SSSP, protected, acknowledged. She looked at him. My mother lived her whole life here without anyone knowing what she was. She died without anyone knowing. She stopped, chose the next words carefully. That ends. Moriboshi was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she thought he was going to say it was complicated, or above his pay grade, or a matter for the council. But he didn't say any of those things. Agreed, he said. Just the one word. She picked up her tea. 14 months, she said again, tasting the timeline. It wasn't so long. She had learned entire albums in 8 weeks. She had rebuilt herself from scratch at 12, at 14, at 16. She was good at reconstruction. She was beginning to understand, good at something that had no training montage and no clear skill path, being the thing in the room that reminded everyone else what they were fighting for. Not a weapon, not a plan. The specific quality of presence that said, I see you, I know what this costs, and it's worth it anyway. Her first single had been called Asterisk, This Is Enough Asterisk. She had written it at 16, in the back of a van, after a regional showcase where 3 acts in a row got standing ovations, and she got polite applause, and she'd cried for approximately 4 minutes and then written the song. It was about the gap between what you want and what you have, and deciding that the gap is not the story, that the story is what you do with the space. It had gone certified platinum in 12 countries. She hadn't understood at 16 what she was writing about. She understood now. Her father made dinner that night. Nothing elaborate, the kind of meal that gets made when a person is processing something and needs to do it with their hands. The steady logic of cutting and seasoning and timing that kept the mind occupied while the deeper part worked things out. He made rice and miso, and a small side dish of pickled vegetables from a recipe she didn't know and had never thought to ask about. And she found herself watching him move around the kitchen with the specific attention she'd been paying to things lately. The way you look at things when you've recently been reminded that they could have been gone. Moriboshi came, she said. I know, he set 2 bowls on the table. He called ahead. You could have told me. You would have prepared something. I wanted you to just, he sat down across from her, talk to him like a person, not a prepared statement. She looked at her rice. Outside, the city was doing the thing it always did, regardless of what had happened to or above it. Moving, generating noise, being constitutionally unable to fully stop. There was something she had always loved about cities, the way they were collective acts of stubborn ongoing presence. the accumulated insistence of millions of people that this was a good place to be, and they intended to keep being here. She would have liked you, her father said. Not out of nowhere, it was a continuation of something that had been happening between them for weeks, a slow unpacking of a thing that had been carefully boxed for 15 years. What was she like? Renat asked. The question she'd always wanted to ask and never had, because asking had always felt like it might break something. He was quiet for a moment, not the uncomfortable quiet of a subject being avoided, the quiet of a person finding the right door into a large room. She was practical, he said, and smiled the kind of smile that meant the word was both accurate and insufficient. She was always calculating something. Not in a cold way, more like she was always aware of what things cost, and she decided that most things were worth it. She'd decide something was worth it, and then she'd be completely committed. He paused. She sang around the house. I don't know if you knew that. She sang everything: television jingles, folk songs from wherever she was from, things she'd make up while she cooked. She had a very ordinary voice. He looked at Renat. You didn't get your voice from her. Where did I get it from? He shrugged, with the particular gesture of someone deflecting a compliment they're responsible for. No idea, he said, which was obviously false and obviously sweet. She ate her rice. The restaurant below was getting busy. She could hear the rise of conversation through the floor, the rhythm of an ordinary evening, people coming in from wherever they'd been and sitting down and deciding to be warm for an hour. She thought about the space where the light had been. 14 months, a good long time. She thought, there are songs in the space. There have always been songs in the space. She picked up her bowl and ate her father's cooking and listened to the city exist below her, stubbornly, as it always had, as it intended to continue doing. Somewhere in the dark of the upper atmosphere, a monitoring satellite tracked the outbound vector of the Velthari fleet, now 3 weeks into deep space and decelerating. The data from the satellite was being routed simultaneously to 17 governments, the SSSB, and the Star Cluster Council, and everyone was watching the same numbers arrive at the same conclusion. They were gone, and they had filed a notation, and the notation was traveling faster than the fleet, spreading through communication networks older than human civilization, and somewhere out there in the vast statistical probability of an enormous galaxy, other intelligences were reading it. Novel variable, unquantifiable resistance, prohibitive cost. And underneath the notation in their own catalog, in the section that tracked specific anomalous events and their identifying factors, a designation had been filed, a taxonomy. The way you label something new that you don't have words for yet. In Velthari notation, it translated approximately as the Orin-adjacent biological event, the one who burns. But she was also Renat Endo, daughter of a detective and a woman from somewhere else, raised above a ramen shop, trained in a basement, voted most likely to make you feel okay about things. She was healing. She was learning. She was going to be very, very expensive. The city hummed around her, full of people who didn't know her name and people who did, who were doing the 10,000 ordinary miraculous things that people did at the end of a long day. Calling someone, making food, opening a window because the air was better outside, sitting with a child until they fell asleep, laughing at something that wasn't funny until it was. She would be ready when the next accounting came. And when it came, she would show them the math again. She went back to the stage on a Tuesday in November, 11 months later. Not because she had the light back, she didn't, not fully, though I'd had shown her the test results 2 weeks earlier with the expression of a man who had watched something impossible happen and was recalibrating his definition of impossible. 60%, he'd said, and rising, good enough to feel, good enough to know it was there, not enough yet to push. She went back to the stage because she'd written 6 songs in 14 months, and they were the best songs she had ever written, and they were going to waste sitting in a folder on her laptop. The venue was small, not deliberately small, but the largest venue that had reopened in the city, which was smaller than the city had been 12 months ago, because certain parts of the city were still being rebuilt, and certain parts of the city had been permanently changed in ways that no city planner had a model for yet. She stood backstage in the dark with the sound of 3,000 people on the other side of a curtain, and she did the thing she always did before a show. She pressed her palm flat against the wall, any wall, always a wall, a habit she'd developed as a teenager that she'd never been able to explain, and she listened. The sound of 3,000 people waiting was not like any other sound. It was not a sound of silence because it wasn't silent. It was the accumulated noise of anticipation, conversations drifting off, phones being put away, the specific quality of attention being turned toward a single point. She had performed for larger crowds. She would perform for larger crowds again. But she had never listened to one quite like this, from quite this vantage point, knowing what she now knew about the value of the thing they were doing simply by showing up. 3,000 people, sitting in a rebuilt venue, in a partially rebuilt city, in a world that had been told it was a resource and had said *no and meant it. She thought about the Velthari's notation, unquantifiable resistance. She walked out onto the stage. The light hit her, stage light, human light, the warm, practical amber of a music venue doing its job, and 3,000 people made a sound that had no word for it, the kind of sound that a crowd makes when the thing they came for arrives, and it turns out they were right to come. She walked to the microphone. She thought about her mother singing around a kitchen. She thought about her father's hands. She thought about Shinjiro getting up every time because falling down was not the end of the conversation. She thought about the Velthari commander kneeling, not in defeat but in the act of revision, of being capable of encountering something it hadn't modeled and updating the model. She had respected that about them, eventually. Not the invasion, the willingness to be wrong. She took the microphone. She sang. The first song was called *Cost of Living. She had written it in the second month in the apartment, at 3 in the morning, with no light in her cells and her father asleep in the next room, and the city very quiet outside. It was about the specific calculation that humans made constantly without thinking of it as a calculation. The choice to be present for each other, to show up, to bear witness, to hold the door and remember the name and sit in the dark alongside. It wasn't a survival calculation. It wasn't strategic. It was the background radiation of humanity, the constant low-level expenditure of attention and care that the Velthari had not modeled because it had no visible utility. It was 3 minutes and 40 seconds long. By the second chorus, the 3,000 people were singing it back to her, which should have been impossible because they'd never heard it before. But the melody was the kind of melody that felt remembered rather than new, and the words landed where words land when they're true, and 3,000 people in a partially rebuilt city sang a song about the cost of being alive and present to each other, and decided collectively that the cost was right. She stood at the microphone and felt the 60% of light in her cells warm in response to it, not pushing, not amplifying, just recognizing, the way a lamp brightens slightly when you turn toward it. She thought, this is also the thing they didn't model. Not the beam, not the push. Not the 3 minutes of full output that had sent a fleet into reassessment. This, 3,000 people singing a song they'd never heard because it was true. The unreasonable, impractical, completely human act of making something beautiful and having it land. The way certain frequencies land in the chest and say yes, that, I know that, I've always known that. The Velthari had assessed human caloric yield and protein density and soil pH. They had not assessed this. She hoped, with the specific quality of hope that had become her compass in the 14 months of rebuilding, that the notation was still traveling, through the communication networks older than human civilization, through the vast probability space of a galaxy full of things that had not yet decided what to make of the small, wet rock, and its unreasonable inhabitants. She hoped the notation would reach whoever was next. She hoped it said, in whatever language carried it, "The math doesn't work here. There's a variable you won't find in your models." It sings the last song of the night, which she had not told anyone she was playing, which she had written on a napkin 2 nights ago when it came to her complete, and fully formed the way songs sometimes did when you'd been preparing for them without knowing it, was the simplest thing she had written since she was 12 years old. 4 chords, 8 lines, a melody that sat comfortably in the middle of the voice, the place where songs lived that you didn't have to reach for. It was called Still Here. She sang it alone, no band, just her voice and the 3,000 people, and the rebuilt room and the city going about its business outside. She sang it the way her mother had apparently sung around a kitchen, without performance, without calculation, just sound in the air, because sound in the air was one of the things that mattered. When it ended, no one moved for a long moment. Then the room was very loud. She stood at the microphone with her hand pressed flat against her chest, where the 60% of light was warm and getting warmer, where the space that had been empty was filling back in, cell by cell, day by day, in the way that things fill back in when they've been spent on something true. She thought about 14 months from now. She thought about the next time someone came with a spreadsheet and a countdown. She thought about the white suit that Ide was rebuilding with a metering system, a throttle, a way to make 3 minutes into 30. She thought, "I'll be ready." But tonight she was just a girl from a 3-room apartment above a ramen shop, standing in a spotlight, in a city that was still standing, telling 3,000 people who already knew it that they were still here. She bowed. The city held them all.